varied intellectual background. As I understand it, you studied psychoanalysis with Wilhelm Stekel, spent some time with Piaget, and very likely there have been other significant influences on your intellectual approach. I'm wondering whether you could describe some of the more significant figures in your intellectual history.
Well, Wilhelm Stekel was my director of psychoanalytical studies. You know very well that he was not in complete agreement with Freudian psychoanalysis. Well, many times he told that, well, that I see in the same extent the suppression of morality, but not suppression of instincts. And he told us in many books that, well, that we should care about not suppress our higher level of development, our morality. We speak too much about danger of suppressing of instincts, of some primitive instinct, but we do not speak sufficiently about suppression of our higher emotional life. Well, this was Stekel. Well, I met many times Jung. I have seen many times and participated in seminars with Freud, but well, Freud was the great personality, I can say, no, personality perhaps, individual and genius, that this was impossible to see me in this group, I understand very well. Well, next, well, I have seen and well, I have some meetings with Alfred Adler also. This means all this group of psychoanalytical people was known by me. Well, next as I told you, I studied with Piaget and especially with Claparède in Geneva. I finished my medical study in Geneva, in Switzerland. And for me, the ideal professor, ideal director of study was Claparède. Less in relation to Piaget. He was for me very, very intelligent, very clever, very adapted toward life, but perhaps not, he presented not such a cordiality, such a sincere attitude toward pupils than Claparède. This was Geneva. Next, I studied more than 1.5 years in Vienna. This means with Stekel, as I told you already. And especially I studied neurology and psychiatry in a special neurological institute with Marburg, who was director in Vienna. I studied with Charlotte Bühler and Karl Bühler. Well, in Vienna. Next, well, I received fellowship from Rockefeller Foundation, and I studied at Harvard University 1 year and a half about, in School for Public Health and in Boston Psychopathic Hospital with McPhee Campbell. And even at the last month of my work, I directed by myself many cases as an independent already psychiatrist and psychologist. Excuse me please, that this will be a mixture of my presentation. Before I finished psychological studies in Poland, well, and together with pedagogy, well, and coming back to the Harvard University, I appreciate very much the direction of Dr. Healy. Perhaps you do not know, this is fairly old time, but he was a specialist in criminology of young people.
Dr. Healy?
Dr. Healy. Dr. William Healy with Augusta Bronner together. They directed this clinic. After I was for about 4 months a student of Adolf Meyer in Baltimore. And I met him even in many discussions. He was a very, how we can say, very, a man to whom this was possible to approach and to speak and to discuss many things, even with his, how I can say, his high level of scientific status, I can say. What next? I studied about 2 years in Paris. In Paris with Ayer. This was a very great specialist in children's psychiatry. And with Claude and with Jeanne, Pierre Jeanne. And I think that was all what I can say. Well, after my fellowships, I received very, how we can say, very large amount of money to organize Institute for Mental Health in Poland, in Warsaw, with help of Rockefeller Foundation. And this was, I can say, beautiful work, the most happy work. This was 2 years before war and sometime after war. Well, this was something like multi-dimensional and even multi-level experience in the field of mental hygiene, which present, as you know very well, this multi-level and multi-dimensional point of view. Mental hygiene is always unclear for a narrow-minded people and fairly clear for open-minded people. I can say this, permit me such a critic. For this reason, this was, I can say that I have had there many beautiful, many of high-level collaborators, and this was something like atmosphere of friendship. I can say, well, here that's, for me, without friendship, we cannot do the, how I can say, true, deep, multidimensional work. I believed always in this. And this is my great pleasure that I have had friends, authentic friends. This is not so often.
One of the things that interests me is that you did work with Piaget and also Clapeyret, who
yes,
was apparently a greater influence on your work. It strikes me that Piaget is especially interested in intellectual development, and your primary concern is with development of personality, including its emotional and instinctual aspects. Are there any other contrasts that you can make with Piaget's approach?
Yes, in some extent, yes. You know, I cannot say that I was not interested in development of intelligence only because I observed that for such important functions like emotional and instinctive functions, a scientist not direct sufficient attention. I began to work on this. This not means that I am not interested in many other functions. What is especially difficult to accept in Piagetian work, well, I think that's, and you better know than me, that, well, his work is beautiful work in relation to development of intelligence. But, well, what strikes me, that's in relation to such a deep work, scientific work, he does not occupy himself with emotional development, and in some of his opinion, he says something, but this is contrary to his work with intelligence. This is superficial, I think, in relation to emotional and instinctive functions. Well, next, his I can say, model of development. Perhaps this model is very much better than model of theory of positive disintegration, but after all, this is, as you know very well, the most dominant factor in development are association, accommodation, and homeostasis. Well, I do not know, I do not understand why Piaget introduced homeostasis as one from the factors of development. This is perhaps a result of some development, of status of some development, but not a factor of development. Next, well, I do not understand clearly that homeostasis is in the same time something like symptoms of mental health, in his opinion. Well, in my practice, very large practice, I have seen many times the development through going away for concrete status of homeostasis and to go toward disintegration and another higher level of equilibrium, of homeostasis. This means homeostasis as a phenomenon is also multi-level. We cannot say that this exists only one homeostasis, but there are many, on many different levels. And well, homeostasis of psychopaths is of very low level, because psychopaths could have something like, could be on the level of homeostasis. But if they have something like small, even small potential for development, they should go out from this level of homeostasis and go through this disintegration and to reach little by little another level of homeostasis, of equilibrium. Well, this is perhaps the most dominant traits with which I am in some attitude of different approach. But perhaps this approach is not true, my approach.
Piaget talks about certain stages of intellectual development, or at least various structures at various stages of intellectual development. And Freud talks about psychosexual stages of development. I wonder, your understanding of levels, which you distinguish from stages, I know has been influenced by other people, and I wonder if you could comment on some of those. For example, when you make a distinction at reintegration at a secondary level or at the level of personality, you talk about common essences and ideal essences. You use the word essence, which someone has compared to, say, St. Thomas Aquinas' use of essence. I know that people like Nikolai Hartmann and Max Scheler have been also talked from a very different perspective about levels. To what extent have these people, which are more in the philosophical tradition rather than in the neurological or the psychoanalytic tradition or in the psychological tradition, affected your theory?
Yes. Well, I am in many agreement with Scheler, as you, I think, suspect this. Mm-hmm. Well, I am not in agreement with St. Thomas Aquinas, even with my strong religious instinct. No, his essence was rather something intellectual and abstractive. Well, notion with Scheler. Next, I think from many points of view with Kierkegaard. With Kierkegaard, he differentiates all the levels, as you know. Mm-hmm. Well, what is difference between, especially between Scheler and my opinions? He did not elaborate the empirical notion of essences, individual essence and common essence. Mm-hmm. But I agree very clearly with his opinion toward levels of development and with philosophical and psychological attitude against relativistic philosophy and I can say relativistic psychology. Here we agree completely. And I agree with him, and he gave me many things as a material for thinking. Well, although I agree very clearly with his anti-Kantian notion of common sense and common agreements in something like common judgment. In his opinion, well, common judgment means a very low level of judgments and a very low level of feelings. And this is comprehensive from his point of view of a multi-levelness and a multi-level system of value, of, how we can say, of structure and functions of value. Well, this is briefly. As you know, in relation to Kierkegaard, perhaps I speak to...
No, by all means. Are you referring to the ethical, aesthetic, and religious?
Yes, sure.
And
well, and about his opinion also about something like similar to my notion of essence, but well, his attitude toward essence as a very concrete notion. He disliked abstractive notion of this, like me.
Not in the sense of mysticism.
No, in sense, in relation to mysticism, you know that his opinion was against all mysticism and of mysticism of East and of West. In relation to something like not concrete experience, but something like, well, not sufficiently defined notions, like enlightenment, like, well, identity with moral principle and God and so on. And this was not elaborated, in my opinion, also in Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. And I was very happy when I found in Kierkegaard the same attitude toward this unclearness of mystical experience, because I accept the value, great value of mystical experience. But this should be very empirically, logically elaborated. And such a mysticism should present traits of individual experience. This is almost never, or very rarely, any presentation of individual experience, of individual, how we can say, of individual facts and aspirations and relation toward other individuals and so on.
Partially because mystical experiences are frequently described as ones in which there is dissolution of self. It seems to me to be inconsistent with what you talk about in the subject-object dynamism as an important factor in development.
Well, if you permit me, I am completely against all these schools, and perhaps I have no right to be, but this is permitted, I think, not to understand such a philosophical systems. You know, that's very great yogi here in California, Yogananda, well told in his autobiography that one pupil is coming to him and asked, what will be hereafter with my guru? Could I differentiate him and know him and meet him and so on? And Yogananda told, oh no, never. You will be not differentiated from your guru. You will be the same. You cannot perceive your guru. Well, and you can see the same in notion of nirvana of Buddha, and even very often in Christian mysticism, you see this complete, not annihilation, but something like perhaps annihilation of individual. And I can say that this is contrary to Christ, because Christ in his life differentiated very clearly and experienced from one side experience of friendship with many people, with St. John, with Maria, Martha, with Lazarus, with his apostles and so on, and from the other side he was always ready to sacrifice himself to all people. This means, in my opinion, this is the highest example of so-called by me essence, individual essence and common essence, or social essence. From one side, all acceptance and underlying of the essential value of individual relation and individual experience, and from another side, empathy, responsibility for all humanity. And this was beautiful harmony between those two essences.
One of the things that impresses me as I listen to you describe this aspect of your opinions is that you have relied considerably on religious references, philosophy, and literature in describing the various levels of development. It strikes me partially because there are few theories in psychological literature now that have the scope that yours does. Very few theories in psychology have attempted to give the kinds of experiences described in literature on religion or in literature per se. They're trying to give them a place, a central place in the theory of man. Part of what that suggests to me is that there has been a greater variety of intellectual influences on the way you've described your theory of man than for most psychologists, who perhaps more frequently read nothing more than other psychologists.
Well, I feel I was interested in this. I can add only one more thing. You know very well the works of Vivekananda and Ramakrishna and so on. Both of them told us, well, they presented opinion to people that, well, why you think about your small personality? All your small personality should be annihilated, and after this annihilation you will feel something much more greater, much more sublime. This means identity with something higher. That's all. Any description, any analysis, only such opinion. Go away from your personality. And take please one thing. Buddha, who accepted transmigration and accepted individual development because he accepted individual karma. This means responsibility for development. After he accepts that after all this, perhaps millions of years of development, all will be ended in nirvana. This means existence, not existence. This is, I think, that's for people who want to authentically to think, this is incomprehensible. And for this reason, even many, not too many, but after many Hindu philosophers told us, this is something that's Buddha presented very high level of love for humanity, surely, and here he presented terribly high level, but from the other side, from the point of view of metaphysics, and especially philosophy of becoming, of development, he presented very great, how I can say, lack of any hope for humanity and for individual people. Excuse me for such a long exposition.
It's very tempting to suggest that this might be a reflection of, say, our entire Western civilization, dating back to the Greeks as opposed to, say, various Oriental trends. But perhaps we can get into that later. One of the things that I'd like to get into is that your understanding or your criticism, say, of Shaler, that there isn't an empirical, there isn't the empirical method, or there isn't any attempt to empirically determine the various levels or the hierarchies of value, the various levels of personality. Now, in your own theory, you claim that you came to these various values or these various levels via an empirical method.
Yes.
And that empirical method is one of the case study, the individual
yes.
case study.
Case studies and biographies.
This is,
yes.
The case study and biographies, of course, I think are used by Freud as well in the formulation of a theory. It seems to me that, especially in the case of autobiographies or biographies, that type of method is not used very much anymore, or not presently used very much in psychology. Would you say that it is a method that is a genuinely empirical method?
Yes, I think so. And why? Well, if I presented the theory of Jackson, who differentiate levels in activity of nervous system, and for about 35 years I tried to elaborate such a levels in psychological experience. For instance, from one side, attitude of primitive instincts, and from another side, reflective way of approach toward reality. From one side, aggressivity, from another side, love, from one side, I can say egocentricity, from another side, ultracentrism, from one side, how I can say, education, subordination to education as education of animals, from another side, auto-education, self-education, and auto-psychotherapy, from one side, psychopathy, from another side, psychoneurosis, and well, I elaborate with my collaborators such a lists, about 100 of different levels, on the basis of cases, and especially longitudinal cases. If, for instance, if after something like primarily elaboration of the theory, I found in many cases something like appearance of new dynamism in development. Before I could not see such a dynamism. And after 3-4 years, I discover the presence of such a higher level of dynamism. And I discover that with such a dynamism are linked other dynamism. And that's, I observe this very often in development, with repetition of the same group of dynamisms. Well, in group, well, I decided in some extent that this is something like empirical study. And after elaboration of structure of psychopaths, elaboration of structure and dynamism of unilevel disintegration, accepted as a, well, how I can say, superficially, as a hypothesis. But after I verified many years this, after elaboration, not elaboration, but differentiation of dynamism of third level, fourth level, fifth, and even this same in biographies of eminent personalities, not in all, but in mostly. This means collaboration between the so-called instinct of creativity and, in my terminology, instinct of self-perfection, well, as a highest level of development. This linking instinct of creativity with instinct of self-perfection. And this was repeated and repeated in 1,000 cases. Well, I accept that this is something like, how we can say, like law in development.
I'd like to pursue this just for a minute because I think it's somewhat important. Do you make a distinction between your own observations of a case that you have in actual practice, and say the analysis of someone's work? If you, for example, take the work of Kierkegaard, and I know you've made a study of Kierkegaard, do you look at, do you consider that type of data at the same level, or do you take one as more tentative than, say?
Well, I always accept that self-analysis and opinion of Kierkegaard are much more developed than my opinions, always. But if I perceived the same opinions in many fields, well, I accept that this is something which, how I can say, is in harmony with my hypothesis. I'm not sure I understand your...
No, I agree. I mean, I think I see the point. The important thing is, I guess, that the use of, I'm thinking of a book like Spearman's book on the intellect of men, for example, or, where he did something along the same lines, and you have also done this, is taken historical material and use that as the basis of your theory, which it seems to me is very exciting.
Yes, but always clinical side. This means I have had always very large experience with patients, but this is tremendously large. I can say that in my life I have had longitudinal studies of many hundreds, but longitudinal study, clear longitudinal, with, for instance, 6, 7, 8 examination, and many thousand of other kind of longitudinal study, but with not so often repeated examinations. Well, I can say that these two methods, with other observation of many other scientists, gave me the basis for empirical approach to this problem.
What you're calling empirical would perhaps not be considered empirical by at least a significant number of North American psychologists who place a heavy emphasis on prediction and control.
Control of development.
Yes. I think that your study of case histories, whether historical ones such as in Kierkegaard or in particular individuals with whom you've been acquainted for some period of time, in either case you're referring there to a description of a sequence of events, frequently by the individual whom you're interested in describing, rather than finding some of the significant factors which may alter that person's path, alter that person's course of development, and effectively changing them. That would be the strategy that I suspect North American psychologists would encourage you to take. And that means in some way trying to alter the course of development and predict and in fact control that course of development as a means of gaining empirical basis for your theory.
But I use this method also very strongly, I think. Perhaps, well, this means prediction and control of development, surely. But also I observed that depending on the level of development, you will see something like self-determination of the development of the patient. This means he took his destiny in his own hands after some steps from my sides. And in relation to prediction, I use this very often, and I verified if my prediction was strict and true or not. This was always the case in my medical practice and even psychological practice. Always.
Would you regard would you regard the kinds of interventions you make as a therapist as something comparable to the kinds of interventions that frequently psychologists make in experimental settings? I'm wondering whether, although the primary interest is in how individuals embark on this self-regulated course of development, I'm wondering whether what you do in therapy is regarded as an influence on that individual's ability to embark on that self-directed course.
Well, surely yes, but well, with some restrictions, because I tried, as you know, to do very multidimensional, multi-level diagnosis, very strict. And after I tried to present to myself very clearly what are the dominant ways of developing of this individual on the basis of his potential for development. If I have seen that this potential is positive, strong, and so on, I began to do something, first steps, 4, 5 admissions, and after to help the individual to present his program, and to I tried to give the destiny of this individual in his hands, if he presented fairly high level of development, together with psychoneurosis and neurosis and so on. If this was another case, this means case with something like small potential for development or mediocre potential, but with suggestivity toward influence of social milieu. Well, I tried to organize this milieu, social milieu, in the way to help him in a bit better, better chosen direction of development. That's all. This means I occupied myself with his family life, with his parents, with his playmates, with his studies, and so on and so on, and act through many multidimensional small therapy.
Have you ever, by any chance, compared a group of individuals who are disposed toward sort of positive development with a comparable group who are equally predisposed toward development, but have also had your therapy? I'm wondering to what extent the specific things that you do in helping that individual organize his milieu affects the extent or the depth of his growth.
Yes, well, I try always to do, before of any group therapy, the individual diagnosis and individual therapy. And
Yeah.
after I try to introduce some of this individual to the groups, but rather with in homogeneous group.
My question is a little bit different than that. I'm wondering, even with the individual therapy,
Yes.
whether you have made any effort to compare those persons who actually have had therapy with those who are similar in their predisposition but who have not. I'm suggesting that some of the interventions that you make may help that individual, in fact, elaborate those dynamisms which are important in your theory,
Yes.
and therefore facilitate
Yes.
the growth process.
Well,
I'm also interested, though, in that this is the kind of sort of empirical strategy that is customary, or at least encouraged in therapeutic settings now, and whether you have made an attempt to evaluate your theory through that means.
yes, very often, but after many years of practice, with my, how I can say, with my respect, great respect toward any patients, I rather resigned after some trials and some diagnoses, resigned to treat people. They are not, how I can say, they are not patient for specific treatment through positive disintegration. I sent them to another physician, to another psychologist, and so on. And this was especially with borderline of psychopathy and normal people, and often with severe cases of psychosis on the second level of development. Rather, I, after some experience of many years, I accepted to my treatment the borderline between 2 and 3 level, and borderline between 3 and 4, well, and almost never in relation to 4th level, because I believed always, and I have very large practice, that these people could treat themselves better than with help of physicians.
It seems to me that one of the things, or one of the aspects of Don's question, is one that's probably somewhat controversial with respect to the theory, and that is, do you find the dynamisms for development in people that you have first selected, where you already saw those dynamisms? In other words, what I'm suggesting is that what you have termed empirical observation, say of biographical data or of your
Yes.
clinical cases, is empirical observation, or is phenomenological in some sense, but is very much contaminated, if you like, by your original understanding of the theory already as you have formulated it. Now, I guess there's no autonomous observation, or no such thing as observation without some theoretical bias or trend or whatever. But it seems to be that in examining biographical data or in examining case studies, that is particular subject to your own particular bias or your own particular understanding of the theory.
Surely, but after all, this theory is practiced by many people, very different as a personality from my personality. Many, already many, and in my country, and even here in Canada, and in United States, and I think that we do not agree in many points, but we agree in dominant points of the theory, and they see the same phenomena, the same dynamism as me. And they are clearly different as a personalities. And
even in the development of their personalities? In other words, it seems to me there's a very close tie-in between your assumption or your postulate that there is such a thing as development in personality and the fact that I can observe this development in other people. In other words, it seems to me it requires a certain level of development in order to perceive development in others.
Surely. This is always, and even I can make a hypothesis that without fairly high level of personality development, people could not treat a special kind of patients. This means to send a patient of a borderline between 3 and 4 level to something like strict organicist in psychiatry will be something like, in many cases I observed, complete failure.
Does that mean that it may be difficult, if not impossible, to develop an instrument which comparable to other diagnostic instruments can objectively assess level of development?
I do not want to commit heresy, but how I can say, I do not, as I do not believe in impossibility to objectivize and to test levels of emotional and instinctive functions, I can say that I do not believe in common attitude, common approach toward difference between objectivity and subjectivity. Even, excuse me please for such a
I'm not quite clear on that.
Well, I will, perhaps I will say this. After all, the field of emotional and instinctive functions was always treated like something subjective. In differentiation with all functions, which was, or judgment, which was based on perception and logical analysis. My opinion, based on many years of experience, is that, emotional and instinctive functions could be almost like other functions.
Like intellectual functions?
Yes, yeah. Examined, in a very objective way. And I think more that so-called difference between this descriptive functions and descriptive judgments and value judgments are without almost value. Because I can say that we can introduce descriptive judgment in relation to emotional and instinctive functions and to describe them very clearly, very logically from the point of view of multi-dimensionality, multi-levelness, and so on and so on. And this statement, I can say, do not exist for me. And more, excuse me please, more one thing. I do not believe in our, I hesitate to say this because after all I have some humility here. But I do not understand the definition of objective in almost all vocabularies. This means that objective means something independent from subject. This is essence. Why? I do not think so. That's for instance, in relation to many levels of beings, such a experience like humidity, like air, like tree, are in the same way perceptive by many different animals and people and so on.
Yeah, I recall the introduction to Martin Buber's book, and he describing the tree from various levels. In fact,
I do not know his opinion about this, but
Very
I think I elaborated in some extent this kind of problem. This means I cannot imagine that this is something like essential objectivity without relation to our levels of subjects.
One of the interesting things, it seems to me, is that objectivity is frequently described as a matter of intersubjectivity. In other words, one person being able to describe something in a way that the other person will accept and agree upon. And if it takes someone who has attained a fairly high level of development to recognize when development is occurring, it precludes beforehand that kind of intersubjectivity would be possible. Because those who are unable to, those who are presumably not developed along that path may be unable to recognize it when it occurs.
This means even in a notion and term of intersubjectivity, we should accept levels of intersubjectivity, levels of each individual. And I think that the notion of multi-levelness is the notion for the future and necessary and indispensable for all school of psychology. Well, excuse me please for such a opinion, but I have such an opinion.
So, for example, in contrast to psychoanalysis, where every candidate is expected to go through analysis himself or herself, you would advocate that type of learning process, and maybe within the psychoanalytic perspective it's distinguished from learning process, but a kind of a learning process as required for whether or not you're in clinical work or whether you're doing experimental work.
Surely.
That kind of training. What I'd like to get to is the point that Don brought up earlier, is the type of tests that you presently use to assess a developmental or degree of development or developmental levels. I know you have a neurological battery which you use,
yes.
And also you depend a great deal on biography.
Yes, and this how I can call this verbal stimuli, test of verbal stimuli.
Could you describe the neurological battery, for example, not in detail, but could you describe?
Surely.
For example,
this is normal multidimensional neurological examination used by any neurologist who treat his examination seriously. This means large neurological examination with all reflexes, with all examination of vegetative nervous system, central nervous system, and so on. And in the same time with behavior of the patient at the time of examination.
What kind of behavior would you be looking at, for example?
Well, for instance, well, may I show you something? Well, I think permit me? Well, for instance, this is one of the examination, neurological examination. You see that many people will react in completely different way. This means they will be descend their hand. My young colleague, well, localized like this, like I localized his hand. Well, I observed this together with all results of neurological examination, and I can hypothesize what means this, not as a unique symptom, but together with all. And I have here plenty of hypotheses. If you have such a reaction like this, similarly presenting something like hypothesis, one hypothesis, if you repeat this in 15 or 20 different phenomena, you can have hypothesis, well, this means this and this. And well, I never treat neurological examination as sufficient for diagnosis, never, but as a helping for other kinds or other methods of examination.
You would use, for example, personality tests or projective tests, and Rorschach tests, for example. I see. So first of all, diagnosis seems to be very important to your theory, which it isn't to some, apparently. Perhaps we can get into that sometime. But also, you use very different methods to diagnose.
Yes, surely. And you asked me about neurological. Do you want to continue something or not? This is sufficient?
I'd be interested in one more thing, and that is whether the neurological battery enables you to determine the individuals who are likely to disintegrate in a and develop from that in a positive way, as opposed to those who may exhibit some form of disintegration but are unlikely to integrate afterwards. Is that the purpose of it?
Yes, yes. You can have hypotheses based on neurological examination concerning levels of development, but this will be, how I can say, never sufficient hypothesis. But together with others, this gives something. For instance, I will show you, permit me, cross your legs, please. Well, let's see here. Well, this is normally reflexed. Take this another. Well, look here now, there, here. No, but not change here. And do like this, very strongly, but very strongly. And look here, much more strongly. And another, yes, much more strongly. You know, I have not hammered, but you see clearly that reflexes are reinforced, very clearly. And well, now cross the legs and look at my hands, at my examination. Next. This is not very clear, but after all you observe his diminution, a little diminution of reflexes in comparison with second reflexes. This means because here is something like control. And well, if you have very strong control and very strong overexcitability of reflexes, this means that you can give hypothesis. Here perhaps we have something like processes of disintegration. This means overexcitability and in the same time self-control of reflexes. And if you have one or two such results, this means nothing. But if you have 20 such things, they coordinate with together, we can give such a hypothesis. Well, here we should search for such things next through many methods.
How about in the biography? What sorts of things do you look for there? For example, if a person relates significant events in his life,
yes.
What type of sign or what type of index would be an indicator of say development? Could you mention that?
Well, for instance, I called these forces which decide in relation to level of development, decide of diagnosis of concrete level. I called them dynamisms, as you know. And if you, for instance, if you will find in concrete case such a dynamism like astonishment toward oneself and toward others, disquietude toward oneself and others, especially toward oneself, feeling of inferiority toward oneself, feeling of, how I can say, dissatisfaction with oneself, feeling of shame and guilt. If you will find positive maladjustment and creative instinct, this is 7 dynamisms. If you will by chance find 5 only from the 7, you can say clearly, we suspect here on the basis of this method 3rd level of development. And I am sure in my practice that this will be fairly sure results and basis for diagnosis. Well, this was your
very much so.
Your question.
What could you just mention the dynamisms? Are these dynamisms, do they derive out of developmental potential? Are these the term dynamism seems to say that they grow or progress in some way.
Surely. And you know, they, for instance, those dynamism I presented to you means something that you are in fairly strong conflict with yourself, and you are at the level of recognition of and experience of hierarchy of values. Why? Because if you will find a feeling of inferiority toward oneself, what means this? That you differentiate subject, object in oneself, and you see your higher self and your lower self. If you find in the same time astonishment toward oneself, you have the same. Dissatisfaction with oneself, the same. Positive maladjustment, the same toward yourself and others. And if you have a group of dynamism which present the same role, the same level, I can say, you can be not sure, but almost sure, that if you will find the same by other methods, you are in your home.